Today we have a story about a woman whose extraordinary gift became both her salvation and her curse. This is the account of Sarah Brown, a humble ledger keeper in a small southern town during the years following the war, whose perfect memory would uncover secrets that some would kill to keep buried. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. From the recovered testimony of Sarah Brown, discovered in the Millbrook County Archives, dated September 1865. My name is Sarah Brown, and I record these events so that truth might outlive those who would bury it. I am 22 years of age, born into bondage and freed by proclamation 3 years past. What follows is an account of the autumn when my peculiar gift, their ability to remember every word, every number, every face I have ever encountered, led me into a darkness I pray no other soul must endure. I came to Millbrook in late summer of 1865, carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag and a letter of reference from the Freedmen's Bureau. The town sat along the Chattahoochee River, its streets lined with oak trees that had witnessed generations of both kindness and cruelty. I took lodging at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Cypress Street, a narrow 3-story building where the floorboards creaked like old bones and the wallpaper peeled in strips like dried skin. Mrs. Henderson was a widow of 40-some years, thin as a willow switch, with grey eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. She quoted me a rate of $2 per week, meals included, and informed me that rent was due every Monday morning before breakfast. No exceptions, no delays. I run a Christian establishment, she said, her voice soft as cotton and twice as binding. We rise at 5, evening prayers at 8, no gentlemen callers, no spirits, no loud talk or laughter after sundown. She paused, studying my face with an expression I could not quite name. And no going through other people's belongings. I've had trouble with that before. I assured her I had no such intentions. She smiled then, though the smile never reached her eyes. My employment came through Mr. Cornelius Webb, proprietor of Webb's General Supply and the town's largest landowner. His store occupied the corner of Main and Elm, a vast establishment that sold everything from farming implements to fabric, sugar to saddles. Mr. Webb had advertised for a ledger keeper, someone to track accounts, record transactions, and maintain the books that documented every sale, every debt, every promise made on credit. I was the only applicant who could read and write with fluency. Mr. Webb was a portly man of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair and a manner that suggested grandfatherly warmth. He wore fine suits and carried a gold watch that he consulted frequently, as though time itself answered to him. Your references are exemplary, Miss Brown, he said during our interview, his office smelling of pipe tobacco and leather. The Bureau speaks highly of your abilities. They mention a rather remarkable memory. Yes, sir, I remember things clearly. Words, numbers, conversations. It has always been so. Extraordinary. He smiled broadly. Then you shall be perfect for our needs. The position pays $3 per week. You'll work 6 days, Monday through Saturday, 8 o'clock until 6. Your primary duty will be maintaining the account ledgers. Every transaction must be recorded precisely. Do you understand the importance of precision, Miss Brown? Yes, sir. Good, because in this establishment, we have certain rules about the books. The ledgers remain on the premises at all times. You may not discuss accounts with anyone outside this office. You may not make copies or notes to take home. And should you notice any error, you are to report them to me directly, to no one else. These rules are for the protection of our customers' privacy. Do you agree to these terms? Something in his tone made my skin prickle, though I could not say why. The rules seemed reasonable enough on their surface. I agree, sir. Excellent. He stood, extending his hand. Welcome to Webb's General Supply, Miss Brown. I believe we shall have a most productive association. I began my work the following Monday. The office was a small room behind the main store, windowless and lit by oil lamps even in daylight. The ledgers were massive leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with names and numbers in various hands. My task was to bring order to chaos, to create a system where every debt and payment could be tracked with perfect clarity. And I discovered, within the first week, that the numbers did not match. Small discrepancies at first, a payment recorded but not credited, a debt listed twice under different names, amounts that shifted between ledgers like shadows moving across a wall. I said nothing. I simply remembered that by the end of my second week, I had memorized 317 irregularities, and I had begun to notice a pattern. Every discrepancy involved a Negro customer, every single one. On the evening of my 14th day of employment, I returned to the boarding house to find Mrs. Henderson waiting in the parlor. She sat in her usual chair, hands folded in her lap, that calculating smile on her thin face. "Mr. Webb stopped by this afternoon," she said softly. "He wanted to know how you were settling in. Such a kind man, taking an interest in his employees." She paused, her gray eyes fixed on mine. "He mentioned that you're doing excellent work, very thorough, very observant." The way she said that last word made my blood run cold. "He also reminded me," she continued, her voice never rising above a whisper, "that you signed certain agreements about confidentiality, about keeping the business of Webb's General Supply within the walls of Webb's General Supply." Another pause. "I do hope you understand the importance of discretion, Sarah. Millbrook is a small town. Gossip can be so very destructive to a person's reputation, and without a reputation, well," she smiled again, "where would any of us be?" I understood then that Mr. Webb and Mrs. Henderson were not separate concerns. They were two heads of the same serpent. "I understand, ma'am," I whispered. "I'm so glad," she said, rising from her chair, "because it would be such a shame if anything were to jeopardize your position here. Such a terrible shame indeed." That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed, listening to the old house settle and creak around me, and for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, I understood that my gift had led me into a trap far more sophisticated than any chain or locked door. They had not hired me despite my memory. They had hired me because of it, and they were watching to see what I would do. The morning after Mrs. Henderson's warning, I returned to work with my hands steady but my heart racing like a snared rabbit. Mr. Webb greeted me with his usual grandfatherly warmth, asked after my health, and complimented the tidiness of my ledger entries. His kindness felt like a knife wrapped in velvet. The discrepancies continued to accumulate in my mind, perfect and unchangeable as words carved in stone. By the end of my third week, I had documented 463 irregularities, spanning back 7 years. The pattern had become impossible to ignore. Negro farmers were charged higher prices for seed and tools. Their payments were recorded in one ledger, but often failed to appear in the master accounts, leaving them perpetually in debt. When they questioned the amounts, Mr. Webb would produce figures that always somehow showed them owing more than they remembered, and they had no records of their own to dispute him, because most could not read or write. They trusted the numbers they were shown. They trusted Mr. Webb's kind smile and patient explanations. They trusted that a man of his standing in the community would treat them fairly. They were wrong. On a grey October morning, a farmer named Thomas Green came into the store. He was a dignified man of perhaps 40, with work-worn hands and eyes that carried the weight of generations. He approached Mr. Webb's counter with his hat in his hands. "Mr. Webb, sir," he said quietly, "I believe there may be an error in my account." Mr. Webb looked up from his newspaper, his expression one of benevolent concern. "An error, Thomas? What sort of error?" "The ledger shows I owe $37, but by my count, I've paid $42 since spring. I should have a credit of $5, not a debt." I was at my desk in the back office, but the door was open. I could see Mr. Webb's face, could watch the brief flicker of something cold pass across his features before the warmth returned. "Your count, Thomas. And how exactly have you been keeping count?" His tone remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "I keep a tally, sir. I mark a stick for every dollar paid." "I see. And you're certain you've counted correctly?" "Yes, sir, I'm certain." Mr. Webb sighed, a sound of infinite patience tried. "Thomas, I appreciate your diligence, but you must understand that my ledgers are maintained by a professional. Miss Brown here has been trained by the Freedmen's Bureau itself. Her records are impeccable." He gestured toward me. "Miss Brown, would you be so kind as to bring me Mr. Green's account?" My hands trembled as I retrieved the ledger. I knew every number on that page. I knew that Thomas Green had indeed paid $42. I knew that someone, Mr. Webb himself, I suspected, had altered the entries after the fact, changing amounts, erasing payments, creating debt where none should exist. I carried the ledger to the counter. "Thank you, Sarah," Mr. Webb said, using my Christian name for the first time. It felt like a claim of ownership. He opened the book, running his finger down the column of numbers. "Here we are, 3 payments of $8 each in May, June, and July. One payment of $6 in August. One payment of $7 in September. That totals $37 in payments against an original debt of $74. The mathematics are quite clear. Thomas Green's face tightened with frustration and confusion. But sir, I paid $10 in May, $10 in June, $10 in July, $8 in August, and $9 just last month. That's $47, not $37. Are you calling my ledger keeper a liar? Thomas, Mr. Webb's voice remained soft, but the threat in it was unmistakable. No, sir. Just because Miss Brown has no reason to deceive anyone. She simply records what is paid. If the numbers don't match your stick tallies, perhaps you should consider that your method may be less reliable than professional bookkeeping. I stood there, 3 feet from both men, my silence as loud as a scream trapped in my throat. I could have spoken. I could have said that the ledger had been altered, that the numbers Thomas Green remembered were correct, that justice demanded truth. But Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in my mind, and I thought of my $2 per week rent, my $3 per week salary, the impossibility of finding other employment in a town where Mr. Webb's word was law. I said nothing. Thomas Green looked at me then, and I saw in his eyes a question, a hope, a desperate plea for someone to stand with him against this quiet theft. I looked away. I understand. Mr. Webb, Thomas finally said, his voice hollow. I must have counted wrong. An honest mistake, Mr. Webb replied warmly. We all make them. Now, you'll need to settle this balance soon. Thomas, I can't extend credit indefinitely. Yes, sir. After Thomas left, Mr. Webb returned to his newspaper. I returned to my desk. Neither of us spoke of what had just occurred. But that afternoon, when I left work, I found a small bundle on the front step of the boarding house. Inside was a carved wooden bird, no bigger than my thumb, and a scrap of paper with 2 words written in uncertain letters. I understand. Thomas Green could not read or write well, but he had learned enough to send me that message. He understood why I had been silent. He forgave me for my cowardice. His forgiveness felt worse than his condemnation would have. That night, I could not eat Mrs. Henderson's supper. I sat in my room, holding the wooden bird, and wept for the first time since coming to Millbrook. I wept for Thomas Green and all the others being slowly bled dry by false numbers. I wept for my own weakness, my own complicity. And I wept because I knew, with terrible certainty, that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I found a new rule posted in the office. All ledgers must remain locked in the cabinet when not in use. Only Mr. Webb holds the key. I was no longer trusted even to access the evidence of the crimes I was helping to commit. That evening, as I walked home through the autumn twilight, I heard footsteps behind me. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows between buildings, could sense the invisible boundaries being drawn around my life. When I reached the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson was waiting by the door. There's been talk, she said quietly, of a Negro girl asking questions at the Freedmen's Bureau office, questions about land deeds and accounting practices. Her gray eyes fixed on mine. It wasn't you, was it, Sarah? No, Mum. Good, because that would be very unwise. The Bureau is understaffed, you know, 1 agent for the whole county, and he's a northerner, unfamiliar with local customs. Sometimes these outsiders cause trouble where none need exist. She smiled her cotton-soft smile. Sometimes they find themselves reassigned to other territories. Sometimes they simply disappear. The threat was clear as church bells. I haven't spoken to anyone, ma'am. See that you don't. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard her call after me. Oh, and Sarah. Mr. Webb asked that you begin arriving 30 minutes earlier each morning. He has additional tasks for you. No additional pay, of course. But then, you're grateful for the position, aren't you? Yes, ma'am. In my room, I lit my candle and stared at the wooden bird Thomas Green had carved, and I understood that I was trapped just as surely as he was, not by chains, but by economics, by fear, by the quiet cruelty of those who held all the power and knew exactly how to wield it. But as I sat there in the flickering candlelight, a thought began to form. They had hired me for my memory. Perhaps they had made a mistake. The early mornings were the worst. Arriving at Webb's General Supply in the cold darkness before dawn, unlocking the office with the key Mr. Webb had given me, lighting the lamps while the building settled and creaked around me like something alive. My additional tasks, it turned out, consisted of organizing 7 years of old receipts and correspondence, a job that would take months and served no clear purpose except to keep me isolated and occupied. But as I worked through those yellowed papers, I began to see the full scope of what Mr. Webb had constructed. It was not merely theft, it was architecture. He had built a system of economic enslavement, more elegant and insidious than any chain. Negro farmers bought seed on credit at inflated prices. When harvest came, they sold their crops back to Mr. Webb, the only buyer for miles at rates he alone determined. The numbers in the ledgers shifted like water, always leaving them owing more than they had earned. Year after year, the debt grew, binding them to the land and to Mr. Webb's benevolence. And if they questioned the numbers, there was always the gentle reminder that Mr. Webb controlled not just the store, but the bank, the cotton gin, the feed mill. Cross him, and doors closed throughout the county. By mid-November, I had memorized 1,217 separate irregularities. The numbers lived in my mind like a second consciousness, perfect and damning. I had also begun to notice I was not alone in my observations. Her name was Ruth Parsons, and she cleaned the church across the street from Webb's store. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor. Each morning, I would see her sweeping the church steps, and each morning, she would nod to me with eyes that held a strange knowingness. On a Tuesday morning, as frost painted the windows white, she crossed the street and approached me as I was unlocking the office door. "Miss Brown," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might spare a moment." I glanced around nervously. "I must begin work, Mrs. Parsons, I understand, but I've been watching you these past months, watching the way you carry yourself, the way your eyes track things." She moved closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I was a house servant for 30 years before the war. I learned to watch, to listen, to remember things I was never meant to know. And I recognize that look in you, child, the look of someone who sees what they're not supposed to see." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." She pressed something into my hand, a small leather notebook, worn soft with age. "My husband, God rest him, kept this before he died. Names and numbers, what he was charged, what he paid. Mr. Webb told him he had died owing $60, but Josiah's numbers said different." I stared at the notebook, understanding its significance immediately. "Mrs. Parsons, if anyone finds, they won't. I'm giving it to you because you're the only one who can use it. You work inside the lion's mouth, child. You see the true numbers." Her eyes held mine. "My Josiah died believing he'd failed me, failed our children, died believing he'd somehow miscounted, that his whole life's work had been for nothing. I need to know the truth. Was he wrong, or was he robbed?" Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from within the store. Mrs. Parsons melted away across the street, and I slipped the notebook into my pocket just as Mr. Webb emerged from the shadows. "Early morning conversations, Miss Brown." His tone was light, curious. Mrs. Parsons was asking about Bible study times. "Sir, dear Ruth, such a pious woman." He smiled. "Shall we begin the day?" That evening, locked in my room by candlelight, I opened Josiah Parsons's notebook. His handwriting was shaky but determined, each number recorded with painstaking care, and as I cross-referenced his records with the numbers I had memorized from the ledgers, the truth emerged with mathematical certainty. Josiah Parsons had died owing nothing. In fact, Mr. Webb had owed him $12. I sat there until the candle burned low, understanding that I now held proof, not just of theft, but of a life destroyed by lies, a man who had died in shame when he should have died in pride. The notebook felt like fire in my hands. Over the following weeks, more people found ways to speak with me in shadows and whispers. A farmer who stopped me on the street to ask the time, then murmured numbers under his breath. A woman who sat beside me at church and pressed a scrap of paper into my hymnal. A boy who delivered firewood to the boarding house and recited a list of his father's payments, like a memorized prayer. They were all keeping tallies, marks on sticks, knots in string, stones in jars, desperate attempts to hold truth against the crushing weight of false numbers, and they were all coming to me. I began to understand that in Millbrook's Negro community, word had spread quietly, carefully. The girl with perfect memory, the one who sees the true ledgers, the one who might, perhaps, be able to help. But I also noticed that I was being watched more closely. Mrs. Henderson appeared at odd moments, her gray eyes tracking my movements. Mr. Webb began finding reasons to walk past my desk, glancing at what I was working on. Conversations would stop when I entered a room. On the 1st of December, a new lodger arrived at the boarding house. His name was James Whitfield, and Mrs. Henderson introduced him as a traveling salesman. But traveling salesmen don't settle into rooms as though they planned to stay indefinitely, and they don't spend their days sitting in the parlor, watching who comes and goes. That night, I heard footsteps outside my door, soft, patient footsteps, testing the floorboards, waiting. I lay perfectly still until they retreated the next morning. I found that my room had been searched. Nothing taken, nothing obviously disturbed, but I knew. A dress hung slightly differently. My Bible opened to a different page than I'd left it. The small wooden bird moved an inch to the left on my nightstand. They were looking for evidence that I had broken my silence at work. Mr. Webb called me into his office. "Sarah, I want you to know how pleased I am with your work," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "You've brought wonderful order to our records. Such precision, such attention to detail." He paused, studying me. "I've been thinking about expanding your responsibilities, perhaps handling more sensitive accounts, the plantation owner's records, for instance. It would mean a raise $4 per week instead of $3. It was a test, more access to more damning information, more money to ensure my complicity, more chains gilded with false generosity." "That's very generous, sir. I thought you'd be pleased. Of course, such a position would require even greater discretion, even stricter confidentiality. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good, because I'd hate to lose you, Sarah. You're quite irreplaceable. Your particular talents are so very rare." He smiled, but his eyes were cold as January frost. "And it would be unfortunate if anything were to jeopardize your position. Unfortunate for you, and for anyone who might be influencing you." The threat to Ruth Parsons and the others was clear. I returned to my desk, my hands shaking. That evening, I found Ruth sweeping the church steps despite the bitter cold. "They know," I whispered as I passed. "Be careful." She didn't look at me, but I heard her soft reply carried on the winter wind. "We've always had to be careful, child. That's nothing new." As I walked toward the boarding house, I noticed James Whitfield following me at a distance, not bothering to hide anymore. The invisible boundaries around my life had become visible walls, and I understood that time was running out. That night, by candlelight, I began to write. Not a formal record yet, but notes, names and numbers, dates and discrepancies. The pattern of theft laid bare in careful script. I hid the pages beneath a loose floorboard under my bed. If they were watching me, then I needed to watch them back. If they were building a cage, then I needed to find the door they'd forgotten to lock, because somewhere in Mr. Webb's system of perfect control, there had to be a weakness, and my perfect memory would help me find it. The wooden bird sat on my nightstand, its carved eyes seeming to watch me work. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows like something trying to get in, or perhaps something trying to get out. The winter deepened, and with it, the pressure. Mr. Webb's expansion of my duties meant I now had access to the plantation ledger's massive volumes that documented sharecropping arrangements, land leases, and crop sales spanning the entire county. And in those pages, I discovered that his theft was not confined to small farmers buying seed. He was systematically stealing land, families who had worked the same plots for generations, freed people who had been promised 40 acres, sharecroppers who had earned deeds through years of labor. All were slowly being dispossessed through manipulated numbers. A missed payment that never happened, a debt that doubled mysteriously, a legal fee added without explanation, until the land transferred to Mr. Webb's name, and the families found themselves working as tenants on property that should have been theirs. I memorized 317 names of people who had lost their land to false mathematics, and then, on a frozen morning 2 weeks before Christmas, Thomas Green came into the store again. I was at my desk when I heard his voice, strained and desperate. "Mr. Webb, sir, I need to speak with you about my deed." "Your deed, Thomas?" Mr. Webb's tone held patient confusion. "Yes, sir, the deed to my 40 acres. The land the Freedmen's Bureau allotted me after the war. I've been making payments faithful every month for 2 years. The agent told me I'd own it outright after 3 years, but I received notice that I'm in default and the land is being seized. I'm afraid the Freedmen's Bureau was overly optimistic about your ability to make payments. Thomas, according to my records, you've missed 7 months. That's not true, sir. I've paid every month, never missed one. Do you have receipts?" The silence that followed was crushing. I was told the ledger was the receipt, sir. and the ledger shows 7 missed payments. I'm sorry, Thomas, but the land reverts to me as the note holder." However, his tone brightened with false generosity. "I'd be happy to let you stay on as a tenant. 50% of your crop as rent. Very reasonable. 50%. Mr. Webb, that land is mine. I paid for it. Your word against the official records, Thomas, and given your previous difficulties with mathematics, the implied threat hung in the air. I could see Thomas from where I sat. I watched his shoulders slump, watched the light die in his eyes. 40 acres, the promise of freedom, of legacy, of something to pass to his children, being stolen with numbers in a ledger, and I had the true numbers in my head. I stood before I realized I was moving. "Mr. Webb," I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and strange, "may I see Mr. Green's payment ledger?" Mr. Webb turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "That won't be necessary, Sarah." "Sir, I believe I may have made an error in transcribing. I'd like to verify." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Webb's grandfatherly mask cracked just for a moment, and I glimpsed something beneath that made my blood freeze. "Sarah, return to your desk." "But sir, if there's been an error now." Thomas Green looked at me, and in his eyes I saw understanding. He knew what I was trying to do. He also knew it was hopeless. "It's all right, Miss Brown," he said quietly. "Mr. Webb's records are the legal ones. I must have counted wrong." He turned to Mr. Webb. "When do I need to vacate the property, sir?" "End of January. That gives you time to harvest what winter greens you have and make arrangements." After Thomas left, Mr. Webb summoned me to his office and closed the door. He did not sit. Neither did I. That was very foolish. Sarah thought there might be an error. "Sir, don't lie to me. You don't think anything. You know, that extraordinary memory of yours, it sees everything, doesn't it? Every number, every discrepancy, every adjustment I make to protect my business interests." The mask was off now. No more grandfatherly warmth. "Sir, I only want to do my job correctly. Your job is to record what I tell you to record. Your job is to be grateful for employment in a town where a Negro girl should be grateful for anything at all. Your job," he stepped closer, "is to understand that you are utterly, completely powerless. You have no voice, no authority, no legal standing. If you speak against me, I will destroy you and everyone who has spoken to you. I have done nothing wrong, haven't you? Mrs. Henderson tells me you've been receiving visitors, accepting gifts, having whispered conversations. That sounds like conspiracy to me, and conspiracy is a serious charge." He smiled, cruel and cold. "The sheriff is my cousin. The judge is my brother-in-law. The Freedmen's Bureau agent reports to a committee I chair. Who exactly do you think would believe you over me? The truth is what I say it is. The truth is written in ledgers I control, witnessed by people who depend on me for their livelihoods, enforced by men who owe me favors. Your truth," he tapped his temple, "lives only in your head, and a head can be discredited." He opened a drawer and removed a small brown bottle. "The doctor tells me that nervous conditions are common among Negro girls unaccustomed to mental labor. The strain of bookkeeping can cause delusions, fantasies, false memories. Very sad, very unfortunate. Often requires institutionalization for the patient's own safety." The threat was clear. Speak against him, and I would be declared insane, locked away, my testimony dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. "Do we understand each other, Sarah?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Then we'll say no more about this. You'll continue your excellent work, accept your raise to $4 per week, and live comfortably knowing you've made the wise choice." He returned to his chair. "You're dismissed." I walked out of his office on legs that felt like water. I made it through the rest of the day in a haze of numbness. When evening came, I stumbled back to the boarding house to find Mrs. Henderson waiting in the parlor with James Whitfield beside her. "Sarah, dear, Mr. Whitfield has raised some concerns. He's noticed you seem agitated, unwell, talking to yourself, wandering at odd hours. He wonders if the work is proving too taxing for your constitution." Whitfield nodded sympathetically. "Mental strain can manifest in many ways, Miss Brown. Perhaps a rest would be beneficial." They were building the narrative. The unstable Negro girl losing her grip on reality. "I'm perfectly well," I said. "Of course you are, dear." Mrs. Henderson cooed. "But we must be careful. For your own sake." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the walls closing in. Mr. Webb had shown me the trap's final shape. I could stay silent and be complicit in theft and dispossession, or I could speak and be destroyed, my testimony dismissed, possibly institutionalized. While everyone who had trusted me faced retribution, Thomas Green would lose his land regardless of what I did. I had never felt so powerless. Around midnight, I heard a soft tapping at my window. I opened it to find Ruth Parsons standing in the alley below, her breath misting in the frozen air. "They're afraid," she whispered up to me. "When powerful men are afraid, they make mistakes. Hold fast, child. This isn't over." She vanished into the darkness before I could respond. I closed the window and returned to bed, and for the first time in months, a small spark of something kindled in my chest. Not hope, exactly, but refusal. I thought of Thomas Green's wooden bird, of Josiah Parsons's careful numbers, of all the tallies and marks and desperate attempts to hold truth against lies. They wanted me silent and afraid, but fear worked both ways. If Mr. Webb was threatening me this hard, it meant he was vulnerable. Somewhere in his perfect system, there was a crack, and I had the best tool in the world for finding cracks, a memory that forgot nothing. I rose from bed and pulled up the loose floorboard. My hidden pages of notes stared back at me. 3 months of documented theft, not enough yet, but growing. I added 3 new names to the list, 3 new families whose land was being stolen, and I made a decision. I would not speak yet, but I would watch. I would remember. I would document. And when the time came, if it came, I would be ready. Outside, the winter wind howled through Millbrook's empty streets. Inside, I began to plan. The new year arrived with snow that blanketed Millbrook in dangerous beauty. Everything looked clean and pure beneath the white, all the ugliness hidden. But ugliness persists beneath snow, waiting for the thaw. I returned to work, with my head bowed and my demeanor humble. I accepted the raise to $4 per week with murmured gratitude. I made no more mistakes like questioning Mr. Webb's numbers in front of customers. To all appearances, I had been properly subdued, but in the privacy of my mind, I was building something. The plantation ledgers had revealed a pattern I hadn't initially understood. Mr. Webb's thefts were not random. Every act of dispossession, every manipulated debt, every stolen farm, they all served a larger purpose. He was consolidating land ownership across 3 counties, creating an empire that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the state, and he was using money from northern investors who believed they were funding fair sharecropping arrangements. In a locked cabinet in his office, I had glimpsed letters from a Boston investment group. They had provided substantial capital based on Mr. Webb's reports of profitable, honest dealings with freed people. If they knew the truth, if they knew their money was funding theft, they would withdraw their support. That was the crack in his armor. But I had no way to reach them, no way to prove what I knew without access to documents I couldn't legally possess, until Ruth Parsons brought me a gift. On a Sunday morning after church, she pressed a small key into my palm. "Baptist Fellowship Hall," she whispered. Tuesday night, 7 o'clock. The Fellowship Hall was a humble building behind the Negro church, used for community gatherings and meals. When I arrived that Tuesday evening, I found 15 people waiting in the dim lamplight. Thomas Green was there. So were others I'd seen around town, farmers, washerwomen, a blacksmith, a midwife, all of them people Mr. Webb had wronged. And in the corner, a young white man in spectacles sat with a leather satchel. Ruth introduced him as Daniel Crawford, a law clerk from the county seat. "Miss Brown," he said, standing to shake my hand, "Mrs. Parsons tells me you have evidence of systematic fraud." My throat went dry. "I work for Mr. Webb. I can't." "We know the risk you're taking," Thomas Green said gently. "We ain't asking you to do nothing that would bring harm on yourself. But if you could just tell Mr. Crawford what you know, maybe there's something legal that can be done." I looked around the room at their hopeful, desperate faces. These were people with nothing left to lose, people whose land, labor, and dignity had been stolen by false numbers. "I've memorized the discrepancies," I said finally. 1,423 separate instances of theft across 17 months. Names, dates, amounts, all of it. Daniel Crawford's eyes widened. "You've memorized all that?" "I remember everything I see, Mr. Crawford. Every number in every ledger. I can't forget, even if I want to." "Could you testify to this in court?" "Mr. Webb's brother-in-law is the judge. His cousin is the sheriff, and he's threatened to have me declared insane if I speak against him." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what I suspected. The whole system is corrupted. He opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. But there might be another way. I've been researching land laws and Freedmen's Bureau regulations. If we can get a federal investigator involved, someone outside the local system, they'd have authority to examine the books, but we'd need evidence substantial enough to warrant federal attention. The Boston investors, I said, the idea crystallizing even as I spoke. Mr. Webb is using their money under false pretenses. That's fraught across state lines. Federal jurisdiction. Do you have access to the investor correspondence? It's locked in his office. But I hesitated, knowing what I was about to say would cross a line I couldn't uncross. I know where he keeps the cabinet key. Ruth touched my arm. Child, we ain't asking you to steal. You're not asking. I'm offering. I looked at Daniel. If I could get you copies of the letters, could you send them to the investors? Anonymously. If the fraud is clear enough, the investors would demand an investigation, and that investigation would require examining all of Webb's records. Then the truth would come out, Thomas said softly. Not just my 40 acres, all of it, everyone he's stolen from. I nodded. But I need time, and I need to be very careful. If he suspects anything before we're ready, we understand, Ruth said. You do what you can, when you can. We've waited this long. We can wait a little longer. Over the following weeks, I became a different kind of thief, not of money, but of truth. I arrived earlier each morning, stayed later each evening. I volunteered for extra tasks that kept me in the office after Mr. Webb left, and slowly, carefully, I began to copy the investor letters, not the originals that would be noticed but careful transcriptions in my own hand, documenting every promise Mr. Webb had made and every lie he had told. I was helped by my own perceived insignificance. To Mr. Webb, I was a Negro girl who'd been properly frightened into submission. He'd grown comfortable with me again, careless in my presence. He'd leave documents on his desk, have conversations in his office, while I worked silently nearby. Forget that I was there at all. He had no idea I was remembering every word, every number, every damning detail. But the danger was constant. James Whitfield remained at the boarding house, his eyes tracking my movements. Mrs. Henderson found excuses to enter my room, searching for evidence of betrayal, and sometimes, late at night, I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. On a frigid February evening, I finished copying the last letter. I had everything Daniel needed: proof of false promises, evidence of investor fraud, documentation of stolen land. Hidden beneath my floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth, was enough evidence to bring Mr. Webb's empire crashing down. The question was how to get it to Daniel Crawford without being caught. Ruth had the answer. Sunday collection, she said when we met briefly in the market. Put your papers in the church collection basket. I'll sort the donations afterward. Like always, nobody questions a Negro woman counting nickels and pennies. It was brilliant in its simplicity. That Sunday, I attended service with my heart hammering against my ribs. When the collection basket passed, I slipped my oilcloth package beneath the coins and crumpled bills. I watched it continue down the row, watched it reach the front of the church, watched Ruth take it with steady hands. Afterward, I waited in agony. Had anyone noticed? Had Whitfield been watching? Had Mrs. Henderson followed me to church? 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th day, a well-dressed stranger came into Webb's General Supply. He carried a leather case and wore the unmistakable bearing of official business. "I'm looking for Mr. Cornelius Webb," he announced. "My name is Harrison Mitchell, Special Investigator for the Freedmen's Bureau, Atlanta office. I'm here to conduct an audit of land transactions and sharecropping arrangements in this county." The color drained from Mr. Webb's face. It had worked. The Boston investors had received Daniel Crawford's package, had demanded federal investigation, had applied pressure that even Mr. Webb's connections couldn't deflect. An audit. Mr. Webb managed. On whose authority? Federal authority. "Sir, I'll need access to all your ledgers, correspondence, and transaction records going back 5 years. I'll be conducting interviews with your clients as well. You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can return with federal marshals and a court order. Your choice." I sat at my desk, head bowed, hands folded, the very picture of humble insignificance. But inside, I was singing. Mr. Webb looked at me then, and I saw the moment comprehension dawned. He knew. Somehow, he knew. "Miss Brown," he said, his voice like winter ice, a word in my office. Now, I stood on shaking legs and followed him. He closed the door behind us. "You did this." It wasn't a question. Sir, I don't know. Don't lie to me. Each word was a separate threat. I don't know how you managed it, but you've betrayed me. You've destroyed everything I built. I recorded the truth, Mr. Webb. That's all. The truth. He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You've destroyed yourself, you stupid girl. Do you think winning means anything? The investigator will find irregularities. Yes, I'll pay fines, make restitution, perhaps lose some properties. But I have lawyers. I have friends. I have resources you can't even imagine. He leaned closer. And when this is over, I'll still be here, still be powerful, and you, where will you be? For the first time since entering his office months ago, I met his eyes without fear. Free, I said. His hand moved faster than I expected, striking me across the face hard enough to knock me sideways. I tasted blood. Get out, he hissed. You're dismissed. Effective immediately, and if I see you anywhere near this store, anywhere near my properties, anywhere in this county, I'll have you arrested for theft and fraud and whatever else I can invent. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. I walked out of his office with my head high despite the blood on my lip. I gathered my few belongings from my desk, and I left Webb's General Supply for the last time. Harrison Mitchell nodded to me as I passed. Miss Brown, I'll need to speak with you as part of my investigation. I'll be available. Sir. Outside, the late winter sun was shining. The snow had begun to melt, and I realized Ruth had been right. When powerful men are afraid, they make mistakes. Mr. Webb's mistake had been striking me in front of a federal investigator. Everything was about to change. I moved into a small room behind the Baptist church, a space Ruth had arranged. Mrs. Henderson demanded I vacate the boarding house immediately, claiming I'd violated the morality clause of my rental agreement by engaging in seditious activities. I packed my few belongings and left without argument. The next 3 weeks transformed Millbrook. Harrison Mitchell proved to be a man of relentless precision. Each morning, he set up his temporary office in the town hall and summoned witnesses, Negro farmers who'd lost their land, sharecroppers who'd been kept in perpetual debt, families who'd been told they owed money they'd already paid, and me. I sat in that office for 6 hours across 2 days and recited numbers, every discrepancy I'd memorized, every altered entry, every stolen dollar. Mr. Mitchell's stenographer's hand cramped from writing it all down. Miss Brown, he said when I'd finished, your testimony is the most comprehensive documentation of systematic fraud I've encountered in 3 years of investigations. With your permission, I'd like to submit it as evidence to the federal prosecutor. You have my permission, sir. But the real devastation came when Mr. Mitchell examined Webb's actual ledgers against the testimony of his victims. The pattern was undeniable, and when he cross-referenced the investor letters with the true accounting of land transfers and payments, the scope of Mr. Webb's fraud became impossible to dismiss. He'd stolen approximately $43,000 across 5 years. The Boston Investment Group sent their own auditors, the Freedmen's Bureau sent additional investigators, even the federal marshal from Atlanta arrived to assess whether criminal charges were warranted, and as the walls closed in, Mr. Webb's allies began to abandon him. His brother-in-law, the judge, suddenly remembered a conflict of interest and recused himself from any cases involving the matter. His cousin, the sheriff, developed a convenient illness that kept him from interfering with federal operations. The merchants who'd benefited from his patronage discovered urgent business elsewhere. Power, it turned out, was only as solid as the lies that sustained it. But Mr. Webb did not go quietly. One evening, as I was returning to the church from the market, a carriage pulled alongside me. The door opened, and Mr. Webb himself sat inside, looking 20 years older than he had a month before. Get in, he said. I don't think I'm not asking, Sarah. Please, 5 minutes. That's all I want. Against my better judgment, I climbed in. He rapped on the ceiling, and the carriage began to move. I want to make you an offer, he said without preamble. I'm not interested in $20,000. The number stole my breath. That's more money than you'd earn in 40 years of work, he continued. Enough to buy land, build a home, live comfortably for the rest of your life. All you have to do is recant your testimony. Say you were confused, overwhelmed, that your memory isn't as reliable as you claimed. The investigators will have nothing without you. The cases will collapse, and the people you stole from will be exactly where they are now, with or without me. Sarah, do you truly believe this system will change? Do you think some federal investigation will remake the South into paradise for freed people?" He laughed bitterly. "I'm not the disease. I'm just a symptom. Destroy me, and someone else will take my place. Someone probably worse. That doesn't make what you did right. Right, wrong. These are luxuries for people with full bellies and warm homes. You're choosing poverty and principle over security and pragmatism. I'm offering you a way out. Take the money, leave Millbrook, start fresh somewhere else. Let this ugliness fade into history like it never happened." For a moment, just a moment, I felt the temptation. $20,000, freedom from fear and want, the ability to build something beautiful from the ruins of this ugly chapter. But then, I thought of Thomas Green's carved bird, of Josiah Parsons dying in shame for debts he didn't owe, of all the families working land that should have been theirs. "Stop the carriage," I said. "Sarah, stop the carriage." He sighed and rapped on the ceiling again. We rolled to a halt. "You're making a mistake," he said as I climbed out. "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. They'll tear you apart in court, you know. My lawyers will question everything about you, your background, your character, your sanity. They'll suggest you're a fantasist, a liar, mentally unstable. They'll make you wish you'd stayed silent. Let them try." I walked away from the carriage and didn't look back, but he was right about one thing. His lawyers were vicious. When the civil proceedings began, the investors suing for restitution, the families suing for their land, the Freedmen's Bureau pursuing criminal fraud charges. I found myself on the witness stand for 3 grueling days. Mr. Webb's lead attorney was a man named Silas Hartford, a silver-haired serpent from Charleston. He treated me with surface politeness that barely concealed his contempt. "Miss Brown, you claim to remember every number in Mr. Webb's ledgers." "Yes, sir, every single one. Going back 17 months. "Yes, sir, that's quite remarkable. Tell me, have you ever been examined by a physician regarding this unusual mental condition?" "It's not a condition, sir. It's simply how my memory works." "I see. And have you experienced any episodes of confusion, disorientation, or false memories?" "No, sir. No delusions, no fantasies." "Objection." Daniel Crawford called. He'd joined the legal team as a junior attorney. "Counsel is attempting to impeach the witness without basis." Sustained. The judge, a federal appointee, not Mr. Webb's brother-in-law, replied. Mr. Hartford, stick to relevant questions. But Hartford wasn't finished. Over the following hours, he attempted to suggest I was bitter about my dismissal, motivated by revenge, coached by abolitionists seeking to destroy Southern commerce. He questioned my moral character, my religious faith, even my ability to read and write. "Miss Brown, isn't it true that you accepted gifts from some of Mr. Webb's clients during your employment? A wooden bird carved by Thomas Green." "Yes, sir." "And didn't you meet secretly with these clients to discuss Mr. Webb's business?" "I listened to their concerns." "Yes, while employed by Mr. Webb, while bound by confidentiality agreements. I never shared information from the ledgers. I only listened." "But you were planning to betray your employer even then, weren't you? Planning this elaborate scheme to destroy him?" I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "I was planning to tell the truth, sir. If that destroyed Mr. Webb's business, it's because his business was built on lies." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, and in that moment, I saw Mr. Webb's face across the room. The mask was completely gone now. What remained was simply a man who'd lost everything and knew it. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness after witness testified to altered numbers, stolen land, false debts. Harrison Mitchell presented the evidence of investor fraud. Daniel Crawford introduced Josiah Parsons's notebook, Ruth's testimony, the careful records kept by people who'd known they were being robbed but lacked the power to stop it. And through it all, my testimony stood like bedrock beneath everything else. My memory, questioned and challenged and tested, proved unshakable. On the final day, the verdict came. The civil courts ordered Mr. Webb to return stolen lands and make restitution, totaling $37,000. The federal prosecutor brought criminal fraud charges that would likely result in imprisonment. The Boston investors withdrew all support and sued for additional damages. Cornelius Webb's empire collapsed in a single morning. But as I left the courthouse, a group of white men stood waiting. Not a mob exactly, too quiet, too organized for that, but their intent was clear. "You've made enemies, girl," one of them said softly. "Best you leave Millbrook tonight." Ruth appeared beside me, along with Thomas Green and a dozen other members of the Baptist church community. "She ain't going nowhere," Ruth said firmly, "and you ain't touching her." The men looked at Usa, handful of freed people standing their ground, and something shifted in the air. Perhaps they'd expected fear. Perhaps they'd counted on our submission. They didn't get it. "This ain't over," the man said. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied. "The law has spoken. Time you all accepted that." The men dispersed, but slowly, grudgingly, making sure we knew this was a temporary retreat, not surrender. That night, the church community took turns keeping watch. No one slept much, but as I lay on my cot, listening to the soft sounds of my protectors moving through the darkness, I realized something profound. We had won not because we were powerful, but because we had refused to accept powerlessness, and that refusal had been enough. Spring came late to Millbrook that year, as if the earth itself was reluctant to wake into the new world we'd created. But when it finally arrived, it brought changes that rippled through the county like water through cracked stone. The formal sentencing hearing was scheduled for the 15th of May. Mr. Webb would learn whether he'd face imprisonment or merely financial ruin. But before that hearing could take place, something unexpected happened. He requested to address the court. The courtroom was packed that morning. Every freed family whose land had been stolen sat in the gallery. The Boston investors sent representatives, federal officials attended to ensure proper procedure, and news reporters from as far as Atlanta had traveled to witness what they were calling the trial of the New South. I sat in the front row beside Ruth, my hands folded in my lap, my heart steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Mr. Webb entered looking like a shadow of himself. His fine suit hung loosely on a frame that had lost considerable weight. His silver hair had gone fully white, but his eyes, those eyes that had once held such calculated warmth, now held only exhaustion. The judge, a stern federal appointee named Marcus Thornton, called the court to order. "Mr. Webb, you've requested to make a statement before sentencing. This is highly irregular, but I'll allow it. Keep it brief." Mr. Webb stood, gripping the rail before him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, I stand before this court, a broken man. Not broken by the verdict that was just, but broken by the recognition of what I have become." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "For years, I told myself I was simply doing business, that the South's economy required certain arrangements, that I was providing stability and structure in unstable times." He turned to look at the gallery, at all the faces of those he'd wronged. "I told myself these lies so often that I began to believe them. I convinced myself that my success was earned, that my wealth was justified, that the suffering I caused was simply the natural order of things." His voice cracked. "I was wrong, profoundly, inexcusably wrong." "Mr. Webb," the judge interrupted, "if this is an attempt to garner sympathy—" "No, Your Honor, I deserve no sympathy. I deserve exactly what I've received, the destruction of everything I built on theft and lies. I deserve imprisonment. I deserve the contempt of this community." He looked directly at me. "What I don't deserve is the mercy that Miss Brown has shown me." I felt the weight of every eye in the room turned toward me. "She could have destroyed me utterly," he continued, "could have seen me hanged, could have demanded I lose not just my property but my freedom, my dignity, my life. Instead, she simply told the truth. She didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate, didn't seek revenge. She just remembered." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for leniency. I'm asking that this court recognize what I've learned too late, that the old order is dying, that it should die, that people like Miss Brown, people are dismissed as powerless, as inferior, as insignificant, are building something better from the ruins of everything people like me destroyed." The courtroom was absolutely silent. "I have prepared a full accounting of every family I've wronged, every dollar I've stolen, every acre I've taken. I'm selling my remaining properties to make restitution. It won't be enough. Nothing could be enough, but it's all I have left to offer." He sat down heavily, suddenly looking very old and very small. Judge Thornton studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Webb, the court appreciates your candor, however belated, but words, even honest ones, don't absolve theft on this scale." He consulted his notes. "You've been convicted of 17 counts of fraud, 43 counts of false documentation, and 62 counts of unlawful property seizure. The prosecution has recommended 5 years in federal prison." I felt Ruth's hand find mine. However, the judge continued, given your cooperation and your evident remorse, I'm reducing the sentence to 2 years imprisonment, followed by 5 years supervised probation, during which you will make full restitution to your victims. You will surrender all properties acquired through fraudulent means. You will pay damages to the Boston Malson Investment Group, and you will never again hold any position of financial authority in this state. I understand, Your Honor. Furthermore, Judge Thornton said, looking out at the packed gallery, this court wishes to acknowledge the extraordinary courage shown by Miss Sarah Brown. Her testimony has not only brought justice in this case but has established precedent for how we must address systematic fraud against freed people throughout the South. He turned to me. Miss Brown, would you approach the bench? I stood on unsteady legs and walked forward. The federal government recognizes that your testimony came at tremendous personal risk and cost. You lost your employment, your housing, and your safety to expose the truth. Therefore, by order of the Freedmen's Bureau with support from the Federal Prosecutor's Office, you are being offered a position as an official auditor and investigator. Your unique abilities would be invaluable in examining similar cases of fraud across Georgia and neighboring states. The courtroom erupted in whispers. I stood speechless. The position pays $90 per month, includes housing and travel expenses, and carries the full authority of federal law. You would report directly to the bureau chief in Atlanta. Do you accept? I looked back at Ruth, at Thomas, at all the faces of people who had supported me, protected me, believed in me when I had barely believed in myself. Your Honor, I said carefully, I'm honored truly, but before I accept, I need to know, will this work actually help people, or is it just more words and papers that don't change anything? Judge Thornton smiled slightly. Miss Brown, I won't lie to you. The work will be hard. The opposition will be fierce. Many people have built fortunes on theft, and they won't surrender them easily. You'll face danger, resistance, and constant obstacles. That's not an answer, sir. No. But here is. Change happens when people with power make it happen, but also when people without power refuse to accept injustice. You've already demonstrated that refusal. This position would give you tools and authority to extend that refusal across the entire state. Whether it helps people depends largely on how determined you are to make it help people. I thought about that for a moment. Then I nodded. I accept, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted in applause. Ruth was crying. Thomas Green stood and removed his hat, holding it over his heart, and Mr. Webb, being led away by federal marshals to begin his sentence, turned back one last time. Thank you, he said to me. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. After the hearing concluded, I stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by the verdict. Families were reclaiming their land. Debts were being forgiven. The Boston investors were establishing a legitimate loan fund to help freed people purchase property fairly. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't solve everything, but it was something real. Daniel Crawford approached me, grinning. Federal auditor. That's quite a leap from ledger keeper. I'm terrified, I admitted. Good. The day you stop being terrified of the responsibility is the day you'll stop doing it. Well, he handed me an envelope. Your first assignment. There's a cotton mill in Savannah with suspiciously similar accounting practices to Webb's. The Bureau wants you to investigate. I took the envelope, feeling its weight. Sarah, Ruth said softly, pulling me aside, you don't have to do this. You've done enough. More than enough. You could take that money, buy a little piece of land, live quiet and safe. I could, I agreed, but Thomas Green can't have his 40 acres back unless someone forces Mr. Webb to return it. And there are probably hundreds of Thomas Greens across Georgia, thousands across the South, and you think you can save them all? No, but I can try to save some, and maybe if enough people try to save some, eventually we save most. She hugged me tightly. You're so young to carry this weight, child. So were you when you started fighting. So were they. I gestured to the crowd around us. Age doesn't matter when the work needs doing. That evening, as the sun set over Millbrook, I packed my few belongings. Tomorrow I would leave for Atlanta to begin my training. The week after, Savannah, then who knew where else. But before I left, I had one more thing to do. I walked to Thomas Green's farm, his farm now, legally returned to him by court order. He was working in his field, planting spring crops in soil that was finally, truly his. Mr. Green, I called. He turned, smiling. Miss Brown, or should I say, Federal Auditor Brown. Just Sarah is fine. Well, just Sarah, I owe you everything. You owe me nothing. You carved me a bird. I told the truth, where even that bird was a thank you for trying to stand up that day in the store, even though you couldn't. But I did eventually. You did. And now look, he gestured to his land, his crops, his future. 40 acres of possibility. For me, for my children, for my grandchildren someday. Because you refused to stay silent. A lot of people refuse to stay silent. Mr. Green, I just had the peculiar blessing of a memory that couldn't be denied. Maybe so, but that blessing, in the wrong hands, would have been wasted. In your hands, it changed the world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. I made you this. For your journey. It was another carved bird, larger than the first. Its wings spread, as if in flight. So you remember, he said, that even when you feel trapped, even when the cage seems locked tight, there's always a way to fly if you're brave enough to try. I held the bird carefully, feeling the smooth wood against my palm. Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Sarah Brown. I walked back to Wardtown as darkness fell, the carved bird in my pocket, and the weight of tomorrow's work in my heart. Behind me, Millbrook was changing. Ahead of me, a whole state full of Millbrooks waited. And somewhere in the darkness, I could almost hear the future calling. It sounded like freedom. But freedom, I was learning, was not a destination. It was a choice you made every single day, and I was choosing it. I write this final account from my office in Atlanta, nearly 2 years after I stood in that Millbrook courtroom and accepted a calling I barely understood. The room is small but comfortable. The desk is solid oak, and the window looks out over a city rebuilding itself from ashes, both literal and metaphorical. On my desk sits a collection of carved wooden birds, 18 of them now, each one a gift from a family whose land was restored, whose debts were forgiven, whose stolen lives were returned to them. 18 victories across 2 years of investigations spanning Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. But I would be dishonest if I characterized this work as a simple series of triumphs. The opposition has been everything Judge Thornton warned me it would be. I've been threatened, followed, and twice physically attacked by men who didn't appreciate a Negro woman examining their account books. I've faced hostile judges, corrupt officials, and lawyers whose cruelty would make Silas Hartford look like a kindly schoolmaster. I've spent nights in Negro-only boarding houses that made Mrs. Henderson's establishment look luxurious. I've gone days without proper meals, weeks without adequate rest, and I've learned that for every Cornelius Webb whose fraud is exposed and punished, there are a dozen others who escape through legal technicalities, political connections, or simple geographic remoteness that keeps them beyond federal reach. The work is endless, the victories are partial, the setbacks are crushing, yet I continue. Why? Because of letters. I receive approximately 30 letters each week. Most are from freed people asking for help, reporting suspected fraud, seeking guidance. But some of the ones I treasure most are from families telling me they've harvested their first crop on land that's truly theirs. From children attending school because their parents are no longer trapped in debt bondage. From communities building churches and businesses and futures. These letters remind me that even partial victories matter. Even small changes compound over time into something larger. Last month I received a letter from Ruth Parsons. She wrote that Millbrook's Negro community had purchased the old Baptist church building outright and were expanding it to include a school. Thomas Green had been elected to the County Board of Education, the first Negro man to hold that position in the county's history, and the new general store, run cooperatively by former customers of Webb's, was thriving. Webb himself was released from prison after serving 18 months of his 2-year sentence for good behavior. According to Ruth, he now works as a bookkeeper in Augusta, living modestly and quietly. He makes his required restitution payments on time and has caused no further trouble. She ended her letter with a question. Do you think people can truly change, Sarah? Or was Mr. Webb's confession just another performance? I've thought about that question for weeks. I believe people can change when the cost of not changing becomes unbearable. Mr. Webb changed because he lost everything: his wealth, his power, his reputation, his freedom. Whether that change is genuine or merely pragmatic, I cannot say. Perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is that the system that enabled his theft has been damaged, that the people he harmed have been partially compensated, that his example serves as a warning to others. But I also believe that individual change is not enough. The system itself must transform. and that transformation is happening, slowly and painfully. The Freedmen's Bureau now requires standardized contracts and regular audits. Several states have passed laws mandating literacy programs so that freed people can read their own agreements. Banking cooperatives are emerging to provide credit outside the control of former masters. Legal aid societies are forming to help families fight dispossession. These changes are fragile. They're opposed at every turn. They're underfunded and understaffed and desperately vulnerable to political winds that could shift at any moment. But they exist, and their existence proves that change is possible. Yesterday, I concluded my latest investigation at lumber mill in South Carolina that had been systematically underpaying Negro workers for 3 years. The evidence was comprehensive. The mill owner will face both civil and criminal charges. 17 families will receive back wages totaling nearly $2,000. As I left the courthouse after filing my report, a young girl approached me. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her dress patched but clean, her eyes bright with intelligence. "Are you the lady with the special memory?" she asked. "I am. My mama says you remember everything you see, every number, every word, everything." "That's true." She studied me seriously. "I'm good at remembering too. My teacher says I have a gift for it. Do you think I could do what you do someday?" I knelt down to her level, looking into those bright eyes and seeing my younger self, certain, hopeful, carrying a gift that felt more like burden than blessing. "What's your name?" I asked. Clara Washington." "Well, Clara Washington, I think you could do what I do, and I think you could do it better, because you'll start younger and learn faster and have teachers who can guide you properly." I reached into my satchel and pulled out one of my notebooks. "Here, start keeping records, practice remembering things accurately, study mathematics and law, and when you're older, if you still want to do this work, write to me at this address." I gave her my card, an actual printed card that read Sarah Brown, Federal Auditor, Freedmen's Bureau. The girl held it like it was made of gold. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. "Thank you, Clara. You've reminded me why this work matters." As I watched her run back to her mother, clutching my card and notebook, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope, not naive hope, not the belief that everything would be easy or that justice was inevitable or that the world would transform overnight into something fair and kind, but the hope that comes from knowing that the work continues, that each generation builds on the foundation laid by the previous one, that the bird in the cage learns to use its wings, and then teaches its children to fly, and those children teach their children, until eventually the very idea of cages begins to seem absurd. I returned to my office and sat at my desk, surrounded by wooden birds and case files and letters requesting help. Tomorrow, I would begin investigating reports of fraud in a town called Greenville. Next week, Columbia. The month after that, who knew where? The work would never end. Not in my lifetime. Probably not in Clara Washington's lifetime either. But it would continue, and that continuation was itself a victory against those who would prefer we simply accept injustice as inevitable. I picked up my pen and opened a new case file, and as I began to write, documenting the first details of tomorrow's investigation, I thought about all the people whose names and numbers lived in my memory. Hundreds of them now, thousands. Eventually, they would never be forgotten. Their stolen labor, their lost land, their quiet dignity in the face of theft, all of it, recorded in a memory that could not be denied or erased. That was my gift. That was my burden. That was my calling. To remember when others would prefer to forget, to speak when silence would be easier, to stand when kneeling would be safer, not because I was extraordinary, but because someone had to, and if not me, then who? If not now, then when? I worked late into the evening, my lamp burning bright against the darkness outside, and when I finally set down my pen and prepared to leave for the night, I noticed something I'd written without thinking, a line at the bottom of the page, almost like a signature, for Thomas Green's 40 acres, and all the acres yet to be reclaimed. I left it there, let it stand as a reminder, let it serve as a promise, let it be the foundation for whatever came next. Outside, Atlanta slept, but I knew that across the South, in 100 small towns and forgotten counties, there were people like Ruth and Thomas and Clara, people who refused to accept injustice, people who kept careful tallies and taught their children to read and carved hope into wood and stone and the very fabric of their lives. We were building something, slowly, painfully, one case, one family, one reclaimed acre at a time. And someday, perhaps not in my lifetime, but someday people would look back on this era and wonder how such theft was ever permitted, how such cruelty was ever normalized, how people like Mr. Webb ever convinced themselves that their theft was simply business, and perhaps they would remember that it changed, because people chose to change it, one number at a time, one truth at a time, one refusal at a time. I extinguished my lamp, locked my office, and stepped out into the December night. Behind me, the birds waited in the darkness, their carved wings forever spread in flight. Ahead of me, tomorrow waited with its challenges and possibilities, and I walked toward it the same way I'd walked out of Cornelius Webb's office 18 months ago, with my head high, my purpose clear, and my memory perfect. End of testimony. Record sealed and archived by order of the Freedmen's Bureau, Atlanta office. May these words serve truth and justice for generations yet to come. This account, though fictional, is built upon the testimonies of countless real individuals who fought against systematic economic exploitation during the Reconstruction era. While Sarah Brown's perfect memory is a literary device, the fraud, courage, resistance, and partial victories documented here reflect historical realities faced by freed people throughout the American South. May their struggles not be forgotten, and may their courage inspire continued pursuit of justice.